Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 265, Frank Hart, the first black ultrarunning star, with Davy Crockett. Hi, I'm Jake. This week I'm talking about Frank Hart, who was a transplant to Boston who became a famous star in a sport that doesn't really exist anymore. Hart was a pedestrian, competing in grueling 6-day races where the winner was the person who could run, walk, or even crawl the most miles by the time the clock ran out. He made his racing debut in the Beanpot Tramp here in Boston, but he followed the money to races in New York, London, San Francisco, and beyond, becoming one of America's first famous black athletes. However, Frank Hart's career declined along with the popularity of pedestrianism, while at the same time the rise of Jim Crow raised new hurdles for a black competitor. To tell us about the rise and fall of Frank Hart, I'll be joined in just a few minutes by Davy Crockett, the host of the Ultrarunning History podcast and author of a new biography of Frank Hart. But before we talk about Frank Hart and the sport of pedestrianism, I just want to pause and say thank you to everyone who supports the show on Patreon. I think by now it's probably clear that this podcast is a labor of love. It's how I spend my evenings and almost all my weekends, and it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever done, even if most of that reward is of the non-monetary variety. With your support, however, I can at least break even on the day-to-day expenses of creating and publishing a fortnightly show. Your sponsorship pays for things like web hosting and security, podcast media hosting, and online audio processing tools. Thanks to listeners like Deborah, our first Patreon sponsor to upgrade to our new $50 a month Oliver Wendell Holmes membership tier, we're even slowly chipping away at the huge payment I had to make to settle a lawsuit this fall. To Deborah and to everyone who already supports the show, thank you. And if you're not yet a sponsor and you'd like to start for as little as $2 a month, just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. And thanks again to all our new and returning sponsors. I'm joined now by Davy Crockett. Davy's a dedicated ultrarunner, having completed over 100-mile races. He's also a race director, a serious student of ultrarunning history, the director of the American Ultrarunning Hall of Fame, and host of the Ultrarunning History podcast. Before starting his research into the history of ultrarunning, he also wrote 4 books about American westward expansion. So, Davy Crockett, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, the title of the book is Frank Hart, the first black ultrarunning star. And I just want to start with a definition of ultrarunning. I think a lot of our listeners probably think that people who run marathons are crazy. And I'm somebody who used to run marathons, and I think ultrarunning is pretty crazy. So for our less crazy listeners, what is ultrarunning and what makes it different from other distance running or other endurance sports?
Yeah, ultrarunning is crazier than marathon running. It's longer. So people think of it kind of as anything beyond the marathon distance, beyond 26.2. So there's various races of many distances. Probably the shortest is 50K, about 31 miles. And it goes up clear to about 1,000 miles. But very popular distance is 100 miles. And in history, it got its name ultrarunning around the 1980s. Before then, it really didn't have a name as long-distance running, but back in the 19th century, where we'll talk about, it was called pedestrianism, if you can believe that, pedestrians, and they were called pedestrians.
From a historic perspective, a 19th century perspective, how did pedestrianism start? It didn't really start as a running sport, it doesn't sound like.
Yeah, it started as a walking sport, really. And it's existed for clear back into the 1700s or earlier, where, people just get in their heads these crazy ideas of, I can walk from this town to this town, 200 miles, and I'm going to do it in these number of days, and I'm going to get my name in the newspaper. and that's what a lot of it was over the decades and centuries, were people just seeing how far they could push their bodies. Marathons didn't come into existence really until the early 1900s.
How did it make the shift from just somebody trying to get their name in the paper by covering a certain amount of distance and promoting it to being a competitive sport and a spectator sport? How did it start to gain popularity, sort of the mid-19th century?
Well, first is wagering. Wagering was a big part of this thing. So people would make wagers saying, hey, I can go this distance in this time, and I'll put up this amount of money as a bet. And then people would bet against it. And it started becoming very, very big. I mean, way back in the 1800s, one very popular thing was to try to go 1,000 miles, 1 mile an hour for 1,000 hours. And they would do this. Yeah, they did this on it like a half-mile back and forth course in front of a pub in England. And so they go back and forth, and hundreds and thousands of people would come and watch, make wagers, get drunk, and see if this person could do it. And it became a very popular thing to try to do 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours. A lot of people were successful. And so that's one version of it. But where it really happened was there was a fellow named Edward Payson Weston in the late 1800s who he got a lot of attention when he made a bet that he was going to walk from Boston to Washington, D.C. in 1861 to attend Lincoln's inauguration. And so he had to do it within within 10 days. And he almost made it. He came up a little bit late, but he did attend the inaugural ball. But the story went all over the newspapers, all over the country about this, and he gained really great fame. And so he became but he was a walker, a strict walker. And he after a while, wanted to try to walk 500 miles in 6 days. And he kept trying and failing, but he still got attention.
And those early 6-day races, were those what was known as a heel-toe competition?
Yes, correct.
So what does that mean?
It means you got to have a foot on the ground at all times. If you're not, then you're really jogging or running. And this was popular in America more than it was in England at the time, being this strict heel-toe walking. So some of them became very good, and Edward Payson Weston became very good. What happened was P.T. Barnum, I hope everybody knows who that is, of circus fame.
P.T. Barnum has made a past appearance on the podcast as basically stealing the business out from under the creator of the first aquarium in Boston. So he's been a villain on our podcast.
Oh, yeah. The saying that some attribute to him is there's a sucker born every minute. He combined that with this ultra-running or pedestrianism. He said, well, let me take Edward Payson Weston, bring him inside my giant hippodrome in New York City, a big giant tent. It got later moved to Boston for a time, but it was this massive circus tent. And so he got the idea, hey, let's have this guy go around in circles on a track for days, and then I can bring in a lot of these suckers who will pay admission to watch him 24 hours a day. And surprisingly, it worked. I mean, thousands of people would come and watch him. So then after a while, 1875, then it got the idea of, well, let's not just have a guy trying to beat a clock. Let's have people race against each other. And so that's when the first 6-day race occurred in New York City in front of tens of thousands of people who would come and watch and wager and cheer and boo and get drunk and listen to bands. They'd have all sorts of events going on, circus events. It was reality TV without a TV back then.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty good time, I've got to be honest. As the sport of pedestrianism is sort of coming of age in the mid-19th century, here in Boston, a young man named Frank Hart is also coming of age. And like a lot of Bostonians today, including me, Frank Hart was a transplant. So what did you find out about his background, where he had come from? How did he end up in Boston?
He came to Boston in 1866, so right after the Civil War ended, and he emigrated from Haiti. And we don't know why or what condition, but he moved to Boston. And why Boston? He went to the west end of Boston, which I understand was very favorable to blacks at the time. You know, they had a political say in what was going on in their community. So it was a pretty nice place to live by Cambridge Avenue. I believe Boston General Hospital has kind of taken over a lot of the blocks. But that's...
Yeah, Mass General. Around that time, I think that was the 6th Ward, and that was probably the most concentrated black political power of any place in the U.S. than that one voting ward in Boston. Just such a high concentration of a black population and very politically engaged and enabled.
Yeah, so he lived in various places there on North Anderson Street. I think it's now a parking garage for the hospital. But so he became a grocery clerk as a young man, and tried to survive, but seemed to do pretty well. But once this sport started taking off in 1878, where these walkers could make enormous amounts of winning money and be very successful. And in early 1878, the British introduced new rules for the sport, and they called it go as you please, which means you could run as well as walk. Because the British were better at running than they were at walking, and they kept getting beaten by the Americans. So they wanted to level the playing field. And so Frank Hart, black runner, decided, hey, this is the way for me to start making money for my family. Let me try. He was a pretty good athlete. He had done some long distance endurance rowing that he was successful in the area. But he said, let me try to run.
Do you have any sense of how well trained he was as a pedestrian going into that first race?
He said he didn't have a lot of training, but he had some. There was somebody that seemed to be helping him. But it was still a pretty unknown going into this first race that he would do in Boston.
Tell us about that first event in Boston. How much did you uncover about where it was held, what sort of event it was, and what the reaction was like from the crowd and the other athletes when they learned that they'd be competing against a black man?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So it was held in the Boston Music Hall that was born in 1852. And it still exists, but today it's known as the Orpheum Theater, if that rings a bell with you. It
was also the first place the Boston Symphony performed, a lot of landmarks in the Boston Music Hall.
But they would do other events in there, and somehow they got decided, well, we're going to start doing these pedestrian races in there, and constructed a track. I can't remember how many laps to the mile it was. It was probably about 15 or so. So it was probably a smaller track. That facility is about 130 feet long, 70 feet wide. It could fit a few people in there. Now, this race was open to anybody, and it was a 30-hour race. So it was, how many miles can you do in 30 hours? And the winner would be with the most miles.
Before modern chip timing, right now, if I were to go out and join a road race, I'd have a RFID chip on the back of my bib that would tell the race officials if I tried to cut the course, if I made all the checkpoints I was supposed to make. How was timing and record keeping, and who was keeping track of the laps?
It was tough. Like that? So they would at least have to have one scorekeeper for each runner who would keep track of the laps and write them down and get them to some person who's keeping the overall score.
Would it just be on a chalkboard or something as he went, just hash marks? Okay.
He always had trouble. and the runners would think that they were being cheated out of laps and sometimes get pretty violent. That was part of the fun for the spectators, They, especially the 6-day races, they would say that after the third day, the runners started going what they called cranky, which is with sleep deprivation, they started doing really crazy things, would make the spectators laugh. And, again, it's like a reality show that they participated in. That was a lot of fun for them. But anyway, so Frank, he comes to this race. Nobody knew him. They didn't even know he was black. And it was put on by a man named Fred Englehart, who was a newspaperman, and Frank Leslie's Sporting Times. He came to the starting line, so Fred announced all the runners, and when he got to, he announced Frank, and then his fellow runners looked at him, and they objected. They said, "No, we're not going to run with a black man." And Fred said, "Well, if you're not going to run, you can get out because Frank is going to run." And he did, and none of the runners they all decided to participate. Yeah, but they didn't treat him very good. Some didn't treat him very good. They tried to pull tricks on him, is what they call it, where I think they were trying to get him mad and get thrown out of the race. And then
some of those tricks sound pretty dirty.
Yeah, dirty tricks. Could be like clipping his heels, or as they pass him on the track, pushing them, or they do all sorts of things that would get under their collars.
I could be confusing this with a later race, but at some point, either a spectator or maybe even one of the other competitors basically tried to pepper spray him during the race, threw black pepper into his face.
Yeah, so somebody, I think probably a spectator, tried to throw pepper in his face, but the race director, Fred Englehart, saw it happen. And so he came down on the track and he decked the guy. He gave him one. And then he made an announcement to everyone, if you didn't leave him alone, that I will do the same thing to you. And so then after that, people behaved. So it was really, this Frank Englehart was really a pretty good man, sticking up for,
it sounds like
for Frank.
He had a good debut. How did he finish in that first race?
He won. He won the race. I think it was 111 miles that he did in those 30 hours, which is good. But he would do much, much better after that. But that was a good debut for Boston.
Yeah, for sure. It was a good debut for anybody. It sounds like part of the reason they would start chalking up higher and higher mile totals is that he got more serious about training. At what point in his career did Frank Hart bring on a coach, a trainer, more of a team to help him prepare for races?
It was pretty quick. He did another race that was in the Back Bay of Boston. Yeah. They put up this giant, they called it the Mammoth Tent. And they had a multiple state race, Maine, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, where they would have runners run for 6 hours a day, kind of in a relay, but each runner would have to run 6 hours, pile up as many miles as they could, and then the total over a number of days would determine the winner. And Frank did really good in that. He was the second furthest runner in that. Massachusetts didn't win. Sorry about that. But
So was that the race that was called the Beanpot Tramp?
It was the Beanpot Tramp.
That was funny to read because for a lot of our listeners will know the Beanpot as a local hockey championship, college hockey, sort of a local bragging right championship. So it's funny to hear that goes pretty far back. And
that was 1879.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. That's right in the middle of the filling of the tidal Back Bay. The Back Bay had been just a tidal marsh for all of prehistory up until the early 19th century. And it was in the middle of a decades-long project to fill it in and create this elite residential neighborhood. But while it was partially filled and not yet fully developed, they used it for circuses, rodeos. We had a past episode about a giant Peace Jubilee in the world's, what was at the time by volume, the world's largest building. So it's funny to see also more sporting events being held there. So I had never known about that tent and this event. So that was pretty cool.
Well, and then a couple years later, he raced in another race there in the Back Bay. Now, it was in a giant building that only existed for 7 years that had many different names. Mechanics Hall, New England Institute Fair Building. It covered 5 acres, and I figured out where it was. So it stood where Northeastern University is, I think the PE building, where the PE building is today, but it was on a 5-acre place. But it was massive because the track inside was only 5 laps to a mile, which is one of the bigger tracks that I've seen in these indoor things.
What would be more typical for a track size?
Well, they did a lot of these in Madison Square Garden, the old Madison Square Garden in New York City, and that was about 8. But they were small as like 25 to a mile, just tiny. They had a lot of corners.
That sounds painful doing that many laps.
But you asked if he started training, so he finally did. He not only did he get a trainer, but he got the best in the United States. Daniel O'Leary became the next best of these pedestrians after Edward Payson Weston. And Daniel O'Leary was from Chicago, a Irish American who was just determined to be the best. And he became the best of his time in those 1870s. And he was very inclusive. In fact, the few months before he got involved with Frank, he was training women. And women started entering this sport and doing really well. And so he had a bunch of women that he would train and help. But he saw how good Frank was doing, and he took him under his wing and trained him to do it just like he did. All the techniques, all the way you fuel, and all the things that you need to do to go the distance. And then the really big race was September of 1879. He went to do this massive race in Madison Square Garden. And so this is not just a local Boston thing anymore. He went there with the best in the world. And at first, at the pre-race meeting, this Edward Payson Weston objected to having a black man run with them. And he was pretty adamant about it. And so they debated it. But then the person that was in charge of the race, he was from England, said, nope, we're going to let Frank run. And everybody signed up. In fact, when Frank then signed the agreement, the pre-race agreement, everybody clapped and supported him. So that was pretty nice. But this was a big time race. And the crowd, after a while, started to really embrace him. But they noticed that he walked just like this Daniel O'Leary did, used all the same techniques. So they gave him a nickname, and they called him Black Dan. And you might think that's derogatory, but it wasn't. It was a great compliment. So
they're comparing him to one of the greatest of the sport, basically.
That's correct. In fact, they asked him, they said, what do you think about this? And he said, well, I hope Daniel O'Leary isn't offended by it. But he thought it was he had a lot of Daniel O'Leary and others taking care of him during this race, go for 6 days. And the idea of this 6 days, you go as far as you can, but the clock is always ticking. So you can sleep, you can take rests. They would take him for a Turkish bath even.
I was shocked to read that he left the building, went to an off-site location, had a Turkish bath, came back and continued competition. So were there any rules at all other than the counting of laps ends at the end of the 6th day? Was that the only rule out there?
Yeah, so these go-as-you-please races, you can crawl, you can do whatever you want.
There must be a lot of strategy involved around fueling, around what and when you eat, how much and when to sleep, when to be head-to-head with the other competitors, and when to try to be the only one on the track. Do you have a sense for how somebody like Frank Hart, who had a coach and would have been, I'm sure, trying to approach these races strategically, What's the race day strategy?
Yeah, it would evolve over time, but it seems like most of them, you would think, well, maybe a good strategy is doing an even pace, across all these 6 days, and then schedule when you sleep. It seemed like most of them tried to go all out that first day. In fact, sometimes there was wagers where they would get a bonus if they would reach a certain number of miles the first day, like 120 miles or something like that. So they would sometimes go all out. And I've run 24-hour races and 48-hour races. And I was kind of the same way. I would just, that first day, just go all out and try to bank all the miles and then try to hold on to the end. But for fueling, they had to figure this out. It's a balance of carbohydrates and electrolytes to make sure that all those things are balanced. And they didn't know what those were back then, but they knew that they understood that, hey, taking in salt seemed to be a good thing and would keep you so you weren't nauseous. But they drank a lot of tea. And ate a lot of beef mutton. That's what they called it. So a lot of protein, eggs, all sorts of things. But then to stimulate them, they would drink a lot of booze too.
I don't know if that'd have the right effect on me or not. I think I'd want to lay down and take a nap.
Well, I think some of these runners got drunk after a while too.
Yeah, well, after a few hundred miles, it probably doesn't take much to get drunk either.
And loss of sleep too, because some of these would go at least 2 days without sleeping at all. But the good ones finally were able to figure out. And Frank was very good about this. He could hit the pillow and immediately go to sleep. And then his trainers would wake him up at a certain designated period of time to try to keep him in the running. And in this first big race, he did really well. He didn't win it, and mostly because he ran a 6-day race only 2 weeks before this. I think in Rhode Island, which is a big mistake, but he still. I mean, he came in 4th place and won what equivalent value today is $100,000 of winnings.
That'll make you subject your body to a lot of torture.
And he really took over the audience. One tradition back then is women and even men would purchase bouquets at these stands in Madison Square Garden. And sometimes they'd be giant, almost like funeral arrangements that they would then bring down to the track and award their favorite runner. And then the runner would try to, he'd put it by his little cabin. They all had little cabins.
Oh, yeah, I meant to ask that. So with their sleeping or eating, they had a place to retreat.
Yeah,
it sounds like
stoves,
almost a cabana.
Change their clothes. All sorts of things would go on in there. And Frank just thought it was so funny to see these white guys waiting on him all the time, which is very interesting. And in fact, he'd make jokes. He'd say, waiter, come and bring me this. And they'd all laugh and have a good time with them. But so it was that race that really got his attention. And he came back to Boston as their hero. I mean, their local hero. He was it, if you can think of it. Bigger than any baseball person back then or any other sport. He was the greatest sports legend in Boston at the time, there in 1879 and 1880.
And with the equivalent of $100,000 in his pocket, he didn't have to worry about being a grocery clerk at that point. Backing up a little bit to Frank Hart's personal life, from the book, it sounds like it was hard to uncover a lot of the details about his early years, his life growing up. But you were able to pick up the trail in, I think, 1875 at least, to start adding some detail. So what could you find out about his personal life in Boston?
He had a family, so he he married pretty young, I think around 18 or 19 years old, and had children. However, several of his children died pretty young, which probably was common of the era. died when they were 1 or 2 or 3 years old. So, in fact, I worked on his family history. He had 2 children that survived to adulthood.
How much could you learn about his wife?
Not much at all, which was kind of unusual because for a lot of these runners back then, they would mention their wives. But it seemed like after a while, when he became rich and famous, he spent less and less time with his family. He would travel along and in different cities, and unfortunately, he got a reputation of being somewhat of a womanizer. So he probably, and you can think of this again, professional sports. There's a lot of endearing people out there that want the attention of these famous people. And so he kind of had his pick of fans to get to know.
It sounds like there's confusion even about the name Frank Hart, that either wasn't his birth name or may not have been his birth name. How did he end up with the name Frank Hart? What could you find out there?
Running historians in the past had thought that Frank Hart was his stage name. And I did too, until I started looking into this and looking into some legal documents, birth records of his children. Before he was a runner, he was using the name Frank Hart. But he had told people that his real name was Fred Hitchborn. And in fact, he was buried under that name of Fred Hitchborn. So you can speculate what that is. What I'm guessing is, somehow he came to Boston. I think he probably was adopted by a Hart family and probably further raised by the Harts would be my guess, but we don't know for sure. Clearly he went by Frank Hart for most of his time, but there was a comment made to his closest friends. They knew he was Fred Hitchborn.
But at least at the time when he's coming back to Boston after winning that first, the Astley Belt race, he's being known even outside the running scene by his acquaintances in Boston. People know him as Frank Hart.
Yeah, Frank Hart. Just think of the racial stereotypes of the time, and even today. They were just surprised that a black runner could be so good in long distance running. The racial stereotype at the time was that blacks were lazy and dumb. And that frustrated Frank and he would get this criticism a lot when he wouldn't quite do as well as he had in other races. Newspapermen would call him lazy. And then he would counter, how can I be lazy if I'm trying to run for 6 days? Have you ever tried it?
Right. It sounds like his next really big race, the Rose Belt, which I think is later that same year, as he enters the race, there's a really big reaction to his entry, and then especially afterwards, a lot of not so nice press coverage of the fact that there's now a black champion of this race. How was he trying, I guess his team, because he did have a business manager and a trainer and a growing team at that time, how were they trying to counter that messaging? Or what were they saying in response to that negative coverage?
He finally broke with Daniel O'Leary and hired his own trainer and manager. And you would think he'd hire somebody with a lot of experience. He hired 2 19-year-olds, but unproven, to manage him. But his selection was very good because the trainer he selected turned out to be the greatest trainer of the sport. He would train multiple runners who would set world records. And so I think they protected him because Frank mostly behaved in public. Had a very good reputation, at least during these early years. And so I think they help him not get riled up with the racist comments that obviously would happen during the various races. But at that Rose Belt race, he again won the equivalent of another $100,000. And so he was just piling up the money.
Yeah, I could go for that. And it sounds like that's about the first time where you uncovered documents where he would list his occupation just as pedestrian. Where was the first time you encountered that?
Yeah, it was 1879. It definitely, he left the grocery clerk or occupation behind. And so it's kind of fun when you look on census records to see what they list. And he listed pedestrian.
That's great.
It's clearly a professional athlete he was for the next few years. He was seeking out ways to really earn a lot of money and a lot of winnings and win a lot of wagers. And that was his primary motivation, was really that.
And it's not long after that, in early 1880, he enters a race where he walks away with the world record.
He does.
What was his second appearance at the Astley Belt race like that year?
Well, this is called the O'Leary Belt. Daniel O'Leary, this famous guy. The problem with the major race in the world was a series called Astley Belt, and that was put on by Englishmen. And they just didn't like it when Americans won their race, because the rules are then the defending of the next race had to be in the country of that winner, that champion. And so they just despised having these races be over in the United States where they'd have to travel. And so they would do kind of nasty things like schedule the races really quick when people weren't quite ready for them, to try to get their champions to take it to England. So O'Leary started doing what he called the O'Leary Belt race. And this could only be held in America. And so this was really the breakout race for Frank Hart. He won it, and he broke the world record. He reached 565 miles in 6 days, and I think he won the equivalent of $630,000 at that race. It was a massive race, so much wagering, so many tens of thousands of people would come and watch. And so in just 1 year, he approached the equivalent of our money today of $1 million.
Wow, that's really impressive.
Yeah.
Coming into the middle of his second year, the middle of his first full year of competition in 1880, it's only a few months after he clinches that world record, he has some pretty significant setbacks and some pretty significant health issues. In July 1880, his championship belts from the O'Leary belt, the Astley belt, are on display in a Boston storefront window, and he becomes very ill. What did you learn about what he was suffering from at the time?
The clue is he had a daughter die at the same time, and people haven't picked up on that. And so I looked at her death certificate, and she died of meningitis. And I suspect he probably had it too, because he was down and out for a good month. Many people thought he was dying. This trainer, this 19-year-old, came and nursed him.
His trainer's name at this point is Happy Jack Smith, which I love that as that appellation. So how was Happy Jack Smith trying to cure this meningitis? What was his method?
Oh, he was obeying doctor's orders, which are probably pretty crazy things back then. But I mean, his motivation, he wanted Frank to get back into health so he could compete again and defend the O'Leary belt, the next time. And so that was part of his motivation. But he took good care of him. And after a month, he finally was getting back into health. But I think it really affected him for at least a year. He would try to compete in races and not do as well as he expected he would.
I was kind of surprised to read about some of the press reaction on hearing about this illness. You would think, this popular, respected, world record holding athletic champion would get sort of sympathetic articles when he comes down with a life-threatening illness, but that's not really the way the press reacted when that champion was a black man. What were people saying about this meningitis?
I think there was a lot of race involved there, a lot of racial things, because the minute he would start to fail or not do well in a race, then the criticism would really come, which would be more than it was for other white runners at the time.
Well, like you said, it sounds like it took the better part of a year for Frank to get back to strong competition. He sailed to England as part of a team that was going to race in October 1880 in England, and then another one of his kids died. And there was just a lot of speculation about whether he would be done with competition after all. The book made it sound like one of his several rivalries really helped draw him back into racing. What got him going on pedestrianism again?
John Hughes of New York became his bitter rival. John Hughes was not a nice guy. And a lot of these ultra runners or pedestrians at the time before they would compete in Madison Square Garden, would go to Brooklyn and go to a particular track and train. And so both Frank Hart and John Hughes would go there. And John Hughes, as he would run, would just throw out these nasty racial taunts at Frank, and Frank's trainer couldn't hold him back. And let's just say a good fist fight occurred that day. And Frank got him pretty good. And not only did it happen in training, but it happened at the next race they were both in. John Hughes just despised Frank and would pull all these dirty tricks on him. And so a lot of times these races would end up in some good brawls and fistfights, and the police would have to come in, and the crowds would go wild.
Would a mid-race fistfight be disqualifying, or would the show go on after that?
At times the show would go on. Other times the police would stop the races completely. But I think at these, if I remember, the show would go on, but usually one or the other runners who got black eyes or whatever would have to fall out of the race.
Some of Hart's rivalries, and thinking of, I think his name Charles Rowell, it was fierce competition, but very friendly rivalry, good-natured at least rivalry, but fierce competition.
That's
and then
right.
You have guys like Hughes who are just bad-spirited, violent.
Yeah, so Frank would want to beat Charles Rowell because he kept winning this Astley belt, the world champion. And Frank was just convinced he was much better than Rowell. He wanted to go head to head against Rowell, but Rowell didn't want to come to America. And then when he did come, he refused to race against Hart, probably because he's afraid that he'd lose. And so he had all these things. But finally, Frank did go to England in 1881 to compete in this, what was called the 7th Astley Belt race. And he expected to do very well. But while he was there, his legs swelled up. He got rheumatism, he said, in him, and he couldn't do it. But then what's really sad is then Frank, while he was off on this vacation, I guess, turned into vacation, he started betting on the horses, and both in England and in France. And basically, what I could tell is he lost at least a half of his fortune.
Yikes.
Frank had this pattern where he would win all this money, and he was known as a high liver, which means he would probably stay in posh hotels. He wouldn't really live at home in Boston all that much. He'd be traveling and staying in these nice places, and then would wager both in the races on himself and maybe on these horses too. And so he would, different periods of time in his career, he became penniless. He would lose it all, and so then he would be kind of desperate to try to win the next race so he could kind of pull himself out of this hole.
Well, besides getting maybe a little too far down the rabbit hole with gambling during that 1881 European tour, he also found himself facing some pretty serious criminal allegations. It seems like that turned out worse for him in the domestic press here in the U.S. than in an actual criminal court in England. What was that all about?
Well, the story was that at least from the saloon or house of ill repute, I can't tell which, that he and his friend, which is probably, he called him a servant over. So it was a black friend that came over with him in England. I think the two went to this bar, but he was accused by the lady there of stealing some money. He said, no, I didn't, and ended up hitting this woman. and fleeing. And then he got arrested. And so that's the story that went in the press in England and in America. It just really tarnished his reputation back in Boston, hitting a woman and being arrested. But it turns out that when he came up for trial, that the case was thrown out. It looks like these people in this bar pretty much kind of made up the story that he didn't really steal it. When he came back to Boston, he met with I think it was Boston Globe at the time, and gave his side of the story. Said that he was innocent. But that story never went across America. Only the bad story did.
It seems like this is the beginning of an not universal, but an off and on again stretch of pretty rotten luck for Frank Hart, because he had gotten very significant earnings from his first couple of years of racing, loses good bits of that fortune. And then by, I think, 1882, the Suffolk County Sheriff is seizing and auctioning some of his properties on Beacon Hill. So I guess, first of all, how much property did he end up with? And then second of all, how did he end up in that position?
Yeah, it seemed to be all within that area on Cambridge Street, all within a few blocks of there. So I think he did own quite a few structures there. But what happened was he decided one way for him to earn money was to put on a race himself. And a lot of these race directors, they would make a ton of money. So he put on a race in Boston, and many of the best runners in America came to run. And part of this, how they won so much money after a while, is they would be able to take a portion of the gate receipts for that people would pay to come and watch. So like 50% of the gate receipts would go to the winning runners in different proportions. And so after Frank put on this race, unfortunately, what he decided to do was to take the money himself and not pay the winners of his race.
That'll make you real popular when you try to hold your second race.
He quickly kind of left town. Boston got up in arms. I mean, he got crucified in the press over this. And in fact, they decided to put on a benefit for the winner of the race, some sort of banquet and exhibition, and charged admission to it. And so they could at least give this poor winner of the race some money to head back to California with. After that race, that's when he decided that Boston wasn't being friendly to him. And he started to claim other places of being his hometown. And then that's when the sheriff had to seize some of his property for auction there.
And this is a point when Frank maybe gets sort of run out of town or maybe just decides to reinvent himself. Yeah. But either way, he, like so many people in U.S. history, heads west. So how does he create a new life for himself in California and the American West? Pedestrianism
in California had different waves of popularity, and so he decided to try it out. I think several other runners went out with him, and they would hold these races in this big mechanics hall in San Francisco. And at least for a period of time, they don't know his background. In fact, he kind of invented a false background. He said he was a lawyer. Once that hit the San Francisco Examiner, I think, and Boston saw it, they said, hold it, he's not a lawyer. Yeah, so he kind of got caught on that. And, he's just embellishing his resume a little bit and said that he broke world records multiple times, which he didn't. But that's okay, at least back then. And he did really well. He won races and earned a lot of money there in California. And he thought, hey, I'm going to make this my home. He went there multiple times, and both times did really well.
As he's both in California and in a few other places around the Western U.S., he dabbles in other sports also. He's trying things like cycling, roller skating, baseball, professional baseball. Tell us a little bit about the other sports he tried to make a go of it in?
Cycling, he told people he was a great cyclist. He wasn't. He really struggled with it. So cycling started taking, in the 1880s or late 1880s, I think, started taking hold. In fact, they started doing these 6-day cycling races. And then they also started doing 6-day roller skating. And that was back in Madison Square Garden. He participated in the first 6-day roller skating race, and he was
the descriptions in the book are great. It sounds like he could barely stand up on the skates, and he was determined to compete despite having no idea how to roller skate.
He wouldn't glide on him. He just kind of plod on him or something. But his he'd try and try. I think he lasted over a day before he finally got out of that.
Sounds like he didn't win that race.
He did not. And he never was good at cycling either. And, but he would try, and others did this too. Once these races would go in waves of popularity, and when they started to dry up during certain years, they would try these others. You know, they were good endurance athletes and thought they could do others, but at least Frank did figure out the cycling sport, and he much later in his life became a very good trainer for these long distance cycling and trained some very successful people.
Well, after a couple of years of wandering, Frank Hart winds up back in Boston for at least a little while in November 1885. And I wonder if we could just sort of take a minute and check in on what his life was like at that point, how much of a relationship he still had, if any, with his kids and his wife in Boston. Was he financially supporting them in any way? Did he still have a fortune left from his pedestrianism winnings? Where was his life at that point as he comes back to Boston for the first time in a couple of years?
So it seemed like, when he would come back, the press would always say, wow, this is the first time he's been back in 2.5 years or 3 years. So it was pretty evident that he wasn't spending a lot of time even contacting his family. Although I did find one instance where they said his wife attended one of his races in St. Louis. They said it was his wife. I couldn't make for sure that it was, but it seemed like he did get some news from home that he had his oldest son, which is also a Frank Hart, Jr., was taking up running, that he was being successful in running. And I did find a news article where indeed his son was doing that. So he must have had some contact with his family, but really not much. So by the 1885, his lifestyle, he would try to do different things. Like he did a barnstorming through Pennsylvania with another runner to try to, they'd put races on and go to different cities and try at least once a month put on these races to try to earn money. But, that didn't last all that because they didn't earn a lot of money, and it just wasn't working out.
It sounds like as the 1880s went on, Frank Hart's body keeps failing. His finances get more and more strained. By the time he turns 30 in 1887, from outward appearances, it looks like he is washed up. His career must be nearly at its end. Well, will you tell us a little bit about how he got some of that good reputation back by running some good races and then starting to do more organizing and promoting?
As I researched this, I didn't know the end of the story. I was just researching all these newspaper articles, and I would go year by year. And so when I reached that point, I said, oh man, this is it. He's done. And then I would always be surprised. Hold it. He won another race. How did he do that? I don't know if he got a better trainer. He kept firing his trainers and getting new ones, and probably getting his life in gear and getting more focused and getting better training and then doing better. So he'd go on these waves of doing real well and then not real well. In fact, after a while, he got the reputation of being kind of a quitter in races. So in these 6-day races, you could keep piling up the miles for 6 days. But what he would do is after a while, he'd figure out, oh, there is no way I can win in the money. I'm too far behind, so I'm going to quit on day 3 and save it for another race. And so he had a period of, I don't know, a whole year where it seemed like he didn't finish any 6-day races, that he just really struggled. But all of a sudden, then he'd come back, and it was like, wow, how long is he going to do this?
But I thought it was really interesting to note also that during this period, I think it was in the 1880s or maybe the very early 1890s, Hart was running a race and witnessed the 6-day record getting broken for the 6th time since he had set the record. So that 585-mile record didn't stand for very long. I thought it was really interesting, though, because after that 6th time, I read on. I think I expected, and probably a lot of readers would expect, to see that it was broken again, a week later, 3 months later, 8 months later. But that 6th record was unchallenged until 1984, which A, probably tells you that it was a darn good athlete that said it, but B, I think it tells us something about the sport of pedestrianism. What was happening to the sport by the late 1880s?
The sport would go in waves of popularity, but it was also very affected by a very severe depression, financial depression in the 1890s for multiple years, and it was bad. It was like 40%, up to 40% of the people were out of in unemployment. In some of these cities that these races would be put on. So nobody was going to put on a race where nobody would come and pay their money to. So the sport, after a while, after they made these great accomplishments, I think a lot of the best athletes left it. There was less opportunities to make money. And so, it held on. There was a resurgence during the early 1900s for a few years that Frank even did for a couple of years. But then what really happened was then cities started passing laws against these type of races. They thought that they were cruel. The theater, the clergy, everyone's against them. And so they made rules like an athlete could not compete for more than 12 hours a day. And so it pretty much kiboshed the 6-day races during the early 1900s. So it went into hiatus for decades until 1980. They started appearing again. During
the 1890s financial panic and depression, when pedestrianism was at a low point and not many races were happening, that's when Frank Hart is trying to make a living through other forms of athletics and being a trainer at that time. So will you just tell us a little bit about how he tried to keep the good times rolling, or at least to make a living while these 6-day races weren't really being held?
So I think he was a good trainer. So he moved to Chicago and was hired as the athletic director of the Bankers Athletic Club in Chicago. And in fact, he was the groundskeeper basically on the property where the future Kaminsky Park is located. And so in fact, this is probably his first steady job of his life since he was a grocery clerk, that he was, embraced by this athletic club and training them and managing everything. And it went well, but finally the club decided to close its doors, and that devastated him because he loved what he was doing there. And that was, late 1890s, I think, early 1900s.
That era, the late 1890s, 1900s, is also the rise of Jim Crow. And what did the effect of the new racial codes across so much of the U.S. do to Frank Hart's career?
Well, where it affected him was in cycling. And he wrote a pretty long article into the newspaper where he blasted the cycling organization at the time for being racist, because they were not allowing black cyclists in their clubs and their races, where ultrarunning was. I mean, ultrarunning was inclusive, and thanks to Frank Hart and Fred Engelhardt of Boston, they just said, no, we're letting him in, and that's the way it's going to be. And back then, they didn't have these Jim Crow laws of segregation. So during that period, it was good. And Frank wasn't the only very successful runner of his time. There were several others that were black runners that did really well. But once Plessy versus Ferguson happened, it all got set back. All these segregation laws cropped up. So over the decades to come, it's like you needed to have another Jackie Robinson come forward and break the racial barrier again.
And just with the mention of Plessy v. Ferguson, I will put a little plug in for the past episode 162 about a landmark Massachusetts Supreme Court case, SJC case, that established the legal framework for separate but equal that would be more widely implemented with Plessy v. Ferguson.
Even later, some African-American runners were allowed. In the late 1920s, there was this very famous race across America that was nicknamed the Bunyan Derby from Los Angeles to New York. And they allowed black runners in that, and who did quite well.
I was surprised to read about the women who competed in some of the early ultra running or pedestrian events, because women weren't accepted universally in long distance running until the 60s, the 70s. I know we just passed the 50th anniversary of the first legal women to enter the Boston Marathon. So I was curious to see that there were women doing long distance events that long ago.
There were many, and they did very well. I mean, in the very early years, there was one woman runner who, I think it was in Syracuse, New York. She was arrested for wearing pants while she ran. And so, I mean, that's what they were up against. During the 19th century, these women would also go in these indoor arenas and compete against other women and win quite a bit of money and did quite well. But that all went away. And the attitudes about women until early the 1960s, 1970s started. They had this thought that long distance running would be hurtful. The 1970s, when the ultra running women appeared, and they started running 100 miles and so forth, and setting records again, and they blew past all the records of the women back in the 19th century.
How did Frank Hart's life journey wind up? What was his life and his living like in the last few years of his life? And then when and where did his life come to an end?
So apparently he developed tuberculosis, and which is pretty common back then. It's just so sad how many people died of that. And so he went to Denver to try to recover. And I guess did a little bit, because then he was training some runners in some races later on. But it was just a couple years later that he died in Chicago, and he died penniless. He was given a pauper's grave, probably unmarked, buried in South Chicago. No family members attended his funeral. So it's kind of sad. He had friends, but few near the end, and he had no money. And so the last couple of years of his life, he had to be supported totally by his friends when he was ill.
Were you able to find out what happened to that first wife, Mary, and their children back in Boston? He never had children with the second wife, right, as far as you could tell?
No, he didn't. But yeah, the first wife, she died. And you would think that, well, then he would start trying to take care of his children, but he didn't. I did try to figure out his descendants, and I did a lot of research there, and it was surprising how few descendants he had for some reason. I had 2 adult children, but they didn't have very many kids, and their grandchildren didn't have many kids. But I did finally zero down on that. I think there's about 3 to 5 living descendants now of Frank Hart. And I did find one and got in contact with her. And she knew about Frank Hart as being her great-great-grandfather, I think. But she had no idea about his fame and what he did.
There are a couple other things I just want to ask about the racing. So first of all, if we're talking about these arenas where you might have a track that was 6 or 8 or 12 or 20 laps to a mile, nobody knows what a 12-lap to the mile track looks like. Do we think that the lengths were accurate? Were they really doing these 631 miles, or was it really the distance shaved a little bit for promotional reasons? And I don't know. Is there any way to tell now whether those distances are for real?
What they would do for the big races, they would bring in professional surveyors. And so they would actually, in professional ways, measure these courses. Some of these barnstorming runners would just go create their own events, not measure the courses very well, and claim these enormous amount of miles. And usually those are pretty easy to detect. But I'm pretty convinced that these big time races, these Astley belt races and O'Leary belt races, that they were well measured, because you gotta remember they had enormous amounts of money being wagered in these things. I mean, some races, the equivalent of $10 million were exchanging hands in our value.
So the other thing I have to ask about, as a recovering marathoner myself and still a runner, I have to ask a little bit about the gear. What would the shoes, the clothing, things like that at one of these mid-19th century, 1870s, 80s, 6-day races be like? What would runners wear?
All sorts of things. Sometimes they were accused by the press of running around in their underwear. Really low-class folks, But other times, this Edward Payson Weston, he realized it wasn't just a race, it was a show. And so he would wear this velvet suit. He was famous for. So yeah, a lot of times they would come in these very flashy costumes. They would call them pedestrian costumes instead of running gear.
Yeah. And velvet suits are notorious for breathing very well when you sweat. So it sounds very comfortable to race in.
But so they had problems with blisters, and they would try all sorts of things. They would bathe their feet in alcohol a lot. You gotta think about how many miles they were running, and how many times they would run over 500 miles in 6 days, and what it would do to their body wearing these leather shoes. Sometimes they would get blisters so bad they just run around in stocking feet, I think. And the tracks, they were very particular on these tracks. These weren't just wooden floors. They were sawdust and dirt, kind of compressed. They would roll them out. They would criticize certain races of having terrible, terrible tracks, but they would spend a lot of time and money in Madison Square Garden and probably the Boston Music Hall there too, to try to make the tracks good. And Boston had a lot of races. I think between 20 and 30 of these big time races.
Here in Boston, it sounds like the big venues were the Boston Music Hall, Mechanics Hall, and then I think I read there was a casino hall or casino building that some races were held in.
Yeah, so the casino hall, that was that big Mechanics Hall in the Back Bay. So some guy leased it, and then he renamed it for a year, the casino hall. But then what happened is that whole structure burned down after only 7 years of being there and killed 8 people. Ice skating rinks and roller skating rinks were venues. And so in Boston, a Columbia rink, a South End skating rink, Winslow's rink, Horticultural Hall, and a park garden.
Of those, at least Horticultural Hall still exists. Right near Symphony Hall. So I think that's the only one of those venues that still exists, but don't quote me on that.
For a while, roller skating got to be pretty big, and then in the winter, they could convert them to ice skating. And so they had a lot of these cities, including Boston, would have multiple of these rinks.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about you as well. So along with the book, which I'll plug one more time, Frank Hart, the first Black ultrarunning star, you also host a history podcast of your own. Tell us a little bit about the show.
I do. It's called the Ultrarunning History Podcast. So about 4 years ago or more, I I started looking into the history of the sport and discovered that most of it's being forgotten or being curated. We had races in the 1980s that claimed they were the first of the sport when they weren't. And so I would write articles to try to set the record straight. And after a while, I said, gee, I have so many stories here. Why not create a podcast? And as any new podcaster knows, that's kind of a scary thing to do. But I jumped in and was amazed at the popularity, at least within my sport. It seems to be doing well. And the place you go, my website is ultrarunninghistory.com.
Besides writing and podcasting about ultra running, you are yourself a veteran ultra runner. You have, I think, over 100-mile races to your name. Have you ever had an opportunity to run a 6-day race? Have you done Frank Hart's event?
I wish I could, but by the time I wished I did, my age was catching up with me. I'm now 64.
Is it still an event that exists in 2022?
It is. The 6-day race came back in 1980 as some runners started discovering in newspapers about these pedestrian races back in the 19th century, and they said, "Whoa, we should create our own race." And so there was one put on in California, and then a few months later in New Jersey, and that started the 6-day race coming back. And it's not like it was back then. I think each year there's about 20 races held worldwide. There's one going on right now as we speak, as we're recording this in Glendale, Arizona. So they're running around a 1-mile track around baseball fields for six days.
Well, more power to them. I'm exhausted just thinking about it. Well, is there anything that you wish I had asked you today about Frank Hart or about pedestrianism or about the sport of ultra running?
You have done your homework well, way better than most podcasters. It's just important that the reason I did this book is it's not only about his athletic achievements, but it's about really being the Jackie Robinson of the sport, really of all athletics back then in the 1880s. He broke the color barrier. He was courageous and had to deal with all this racial hate against him, but still made it, still was successful.
Our listeners should check out the Ultra Running History podcast. The book, one more time, is Frank Hart, the First Black Ultra Running Star by Davy Crockett. And we'll have a link to purchase the book and subscribe to the podcast in the show notes this week. Davy Crockett, I just want to say thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
To learn more about Frank Hart, 19th century pedestrianism, and modern ultra running, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/265. Of course, I'll have a link to purchase the book, and I'll also include a picture or two of Frank Hart in his heyday. Plus, I'll link to Davy Crockett's Ultra Running History podcast, so you can learn more about this most extreme of extreme sports. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you're on Mastodon, you can find us there as @hubhistory@better.boston. Or just go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop me a line, and I'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.